Hello and welcome to my presentation called The Worst of Enemies. Let's talk about DDoS and RTC. Hi, I'm Sandro Gauci and I'm known to this community as the author of SIP-Vicious OSS, a security toolset for SIP. I've been in cybersecurity since over 20 years, and the last 13 years I spent them doing offensive security, leading enable security. What we do is penetration testing and security research in the area of real-time communications, especially voice over IP and WebRTC security. So one of the things that we do is actually DDoS simulation. And this talk is about the relationship between real-time communications and DDoS. The relationship and also our experience with this topic. So a lot has been happening in terms of news about DDoS and voice over IP lately. It kind of seemed to start with the UK VoIP providers being targeted and being asked for a ransom. And they were targeted using DDoS and their systems were down, no longer accessible. And then a few days later, a Canadian provider, VoIP.ms, was affected. A number of their customers took it to Twitter and Reddit and so on to complain, and VoIP.ms were down for at least a week until they actually moved to Cloudflare. And then the attackers shifted their attention to bandwidth, and bandwidth was also down, and it affected a number of other providers who relied on bandwidth for their telephony services. So this was quite huge actually, and bandwidth also ended up moving to Cloudflare. Now, this is no advert for Cloudflare. We're not sponsored by Cloudflare. I'm just mentioning this because it's what each and every victim company seemed to do to address this problem, at least in part. Of course, they must have implemented other security solutions at their end as well. And then the attackers went back to attacking UK VoIP providers. The Register was covering this, and they made a joke about the DDoS attackers taking the weekend off. And at some point, Bandwidth came up with the news telling us how much they lost thanks to this attack, which is of course interesting, but in some ways shocking. And then it was the turn of Telnix, who spent quite some time dealing with DDoS attacks themselves. And I think that's where we're at. Telnix have been able to address these problems. They are still, it seems, at the time of this video, dealing with some of the repercussions of the DDoS mitigation systems that are in place. But yeah, by the time you watch this video, probably more would have happened. This is a lot of things are changing, and there's news updates all the time about this situation. So from talking with people involved in this, I get the impression that it's mostly volumetric DDoS. The attackers, they are not really targeting the applications or protocols involved in voice over IP, but rather they are targeting the bandwidth, the packet rate limits, and the bandwidth. And yes, there are rumors that there are attacks on the applications, especially SIP, which is mentioned in Cloudflare's blog posts. So that's definitely interesting. But what my understanding is that the type of traffic or protocols did not matter so much to achieve this, what they achieved, to bring down these providers, at least in this particular instance of DDoS attacks. So let's describe a bit the difference between application layer and volumetric DDoS, because I've been talking about this, but it's good to describe the differences. So with application layer DDoS, the focus is to break the target application. Now, it usually means the attacker is consuming too many application resources, perhaps abusing a crash in the application and causing it to go down. Now, a classic example with SIP is the invite flood, which can cause a number of different results. One of them might be the media servers running out of network ports. The other one might be running out of memory or taking too many CPU cycles. Those are typical results that you get if you run an invite flood on a SIP server. With WebRTC, organizations are not immune from DDoS. In fact, you can pretty much do similar to what you do with SIP invite flood on WebRTC by starting a lot of calls, attacking the signaling server, or you might just attack the WebSocket server if signaling is working over WebSocket, or attack the return relays. The point is, in real-time communications, there's a lot that can be attacked to cause denial of service. It's a large denial of service attack surface. And when the attacks are distributed, then they become DDoS. That's what the first D in DDoS stands for. So we have a demo to show off application DDoS. We have three different parts in this demo. We have the target server. It happens to be an OpenSIP server with a very simple configuration. And we have the monitoring system sending SIP ping to see if we can still talk to the signaling server. And we have the attacker machines. So let's start the demo. What we have here, first of all, is this configuration for OpenSIPs. It's really simple. As you can see, it simply sends a 200 OK. No excessive, nothing which is complicated at all. So we start OpenSIPs and we start HTOP to monitoring the processes. And on a separate machine, we can start the SIP ping utility. It sends a SIP options and looks for 200 OK. And we can see that the system is up and running. And then on the bottom, we're going to run ESDDoS, which starts a SIP flood from 3 different attacker machines, each of them hosted on DigitalOcean. And so the attack is now running. And you can see a bit of CPU usage on OpenSIPs on the top left window. But it's all being handled pretty well without any problems. The SIP ping is responding all the time. Now we have stopped OpenSIPs and we're going to edit the configuration. So we're going to add a configuration line that is problematic, that is taking a lot of CPU cycles. In this case, it's running MD5 sum, which takes a lot of CPU resources. And if we run OpenSIPs again, we can see the pinger is responding again, and then we start the attack again from 3 different attacker machines. And this time you can see immediately you start seeing timeouts on the pinger, and you can also see the CPU resources being taken up. So this is what an application layer DDoS might look like when it's targeting the SIP server, the application. So volumetric DDoS is different from application DDoS that we just saw because it relies on saturating the bandwidth and generating high packet rates, for example. So what they're targeting, the attackers in this case, is the infrastructure rather than the application. We also have a demo for this. And same thing, target system, OpenSIPs, no problems with the configuration this time. And we're going to run SIP invite flood again, but it could be any other protocol. And we're going to send a lot of UDP packets, distributed this from 10 different attack nodes instead of 3 this time. And of course, we're going to monitor the system. So let's start the demo here. So we have the same configuration as before, nothing special here. And we're going to set an artificial bandwidth limit using TC. And then we're going to run OpenSIPs. We're going to run the pinger from a separate machine. Make sure that OpenSIPs is working. And just start the flooder from 10 different attack nodes this time. We can see that, yes, HTOP tells us that there's a lot of CPU usage. We can see the pinger reporting some timeouts. But we don't know if this is because of the bandwidth limitations or the application is not keeping up. So what we'll do next is we'll just block those IPs. Using the IP tables firewall, we can block the IPs of the attackers. And so the network traffic that we're sending, which is an invite flood in this case, will never reach OpenSIPs. And we can go back to HTOP so that we can see if OpenSIPs is still taking so many resources, and it's not. However, we can see that the pinger is reporting timeouts, just like before. So the bandwidth limit is being reached. And therefore, yeah, as soon as we stop the attack, the system, the infrastructure recovers, and we're back to normal. So how does this relate to what we've seen in the past during our work? Well, if you had asked us do you simulate these DDoS attacks that are happening on XYZ company, these victim companies, we would have probably said, no, sorry, we only do application layer DDoS attacks. That's kind of our specialization. But really the question is, why not? Well, our clients did not ask for it. And to us, it seemed like an unsolved problem because, you can have bandwidth, but there's only a certain limit how much bandwidth you can afford, perhaps. So, and it's a bit too obvious of a concern. So if you want more bandwidth, if you have bandwidth concerns, then you should buy more, right? Additionally, we also did not have and still do not have a botnet on standby. It's rather easy to buy one in the black market or dark web, whatever you call it. But that is obviously a slippery slope, and it's a very dangerous thing to do when you have a business especially. So we have been offering application layer DDoS simulation, and when we start some of these exercises, or a number of them actually, We often hit bandwidth limits as soon as we start distributing our attacks. So then what we have to do is we have to stop our attacks because this causes problems on the target's networks. And then we start using our rate limiter and slowly ramp up our attacks to find the optimal speed. Now the optimal speed would be the gap between where the application bottlenecks are hit, but not the bandwidth bottlenecks. So we want to find application problems, and therefore we have to find a certain rate between those two limits. Now the thing is, real attackers, it turns out, are not so considerate. They will ask money for this, but not in a very legitimate way. And what we realized also was that we had been doing volumetric DDoS apart from application layer DDoS, but we had been ignoring this obvious security threat because it's too easy to abuse, right? We were finding this problem kind of by mistake. But why is DDoS such a huge problem for RTC? Well, the thing is, real time is really not compatible with downtime. There's a wide exposure to DOS attacks, as I described earlier, so many ways to cause trouble. And the thing is, to victim companies and their customers especially, it doesn't matter if DDoS is volumetric or application layer. So what matters is how much of an attack can you handle as a platform, as a service, and how quickly can you recover. So what do we do? Well, if you want to protect against DDoS, then like any other problem, first you need to acknowledge that you have a problem. You need to know what your limitations are in terms of bandwidth, in terms of resources, in terms of applications. You need to know what happens when those limits are reached. And if you're attacked and the attack is stopped at some point, is the service able to quickly recover? These are all questions that need to be answered. Now, so we need to start from a position of knowledge and testing that knowledge. DDoS simulation has an important role here because it can feed that knowledge, but on its own, it's not enough. So it's important that after DDoS simulation and during as well, that the engineers and the people involved can act on the results, right? And what sort of things might one do? Well, there might be network infrastructure changes. There might be getting help from providers who have enough bandwidth, more bandwidth than you do, to handle these attacks. And they should also have experience with DDoS mitigation, these providers. And of course, don't forget the application layer vulnerabilities. The applications might need to be updated, the configurations need to be updated so that they are robust against DDoS. And then, well, then what you need to do is to test again. Do these solutions work as intended, or do they create new problems? What are the gaps? Okay, what's missing in the protection in place? And also you need to keep in mind that attacks evolve. So you need to kind of try to be a step ahead. Attacks change in protocols, in their nature, in the volumes, and so on and so forth. And also networks change. So a bit about resilience. With each change, say network change, application changes, design changes, and so on, we need to keep in mind that the system needs to be resilient. And this is not something that you can patch later. This needs to be part of the thought process that goes into each change. So that brings me to a conclusion. I would like to thank Alan for inviting me to give this presentation, and my colleague Alfred for the demos, and of course our clients for allowing us to cause trouble on their applications and networks. If you'd like to keep in touch, there's my email address, and you can check out our blog, Communication Breakdown. It's at rtcsec.com. And of course, please do subscribe to our newsletter. It's a way to keep up to date with the latest RTC security news. Well, thank you for watching.